safety was the big issue in this year's race for mayor. And while out on the campaign trail, then candidate Brandon Johnson told us that if we elected him, he'd roll out a comprehensive strategy to make Chicago streets safer. And shortly after being sworn in, newly elected Mayor Johnson announced his plan for summer safety. So how did the plan fare on its first big test over the Memorial Day weekend? Well, I'm Andrea Zopp. This is Chicago Newsroom 2.0, and this week we'll talk all things safety. But up first is my one-on-one interview with Tiffany Hamill-Johnson, CEO of Chicago United, right after this.
This week on In the Money, we will learn about the economy and how to weather the storm of higher prices.
The price of our eggs and the price of, food. We have to look at cutting back on spending.
Because yes, no jobs in this area, no trucks to bring the supply to us. Now we have to pay more in order to get that.
In the Money airs on Thursday at 7 o'clock p.m. on CanTV, cantv.org, and on the all-new CanTV Plus app.
Today's first guest helms an organization whose mission is to make the Chicagoland region the most inclusive business ecosystem in the nation. And it takes on that very big task by working to expand the talent pipeline for executive level management and growing minority businesses. How exactly do they get that done? Well, here to explain more is Tiffany Hamill-Johnson, President and CEO of Chicago United. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thanks, Andy.
But your past in not-for-profit work and inclusion and economic opportunity makes you perfect for the Chicago United role. But for our listeners and watchers who don't know what Chicago United does and is, can you tell us a little bit about Chicago United? What do you do? How did you start? And what are your kind of objectives and goals for the organization?
So Chicago United is actually a 55-year-old membership organization, advocacy organization, whose mission is to achieve economic parity for people of color, by advancing multiracial leadership in corporate governance, executive level management, and in minority businesses. And as you said, our vision at the end of the day is to create a Chicago business ecosystem that is inclusive, the most inclusive in the nation. We are made up of nearly 100 companies that span from Fortune 500 companies to mid-sized companies, and minority businesses, and then small law firms. We've also over the last couple of years have added on, it's not just private organizations, but hospitals, Economic Club of Chicago. So we have also seen this transition in the last couple of years of more organizations that maybe are not private, but they are organizations that want to see their leadership ranks more diverse. They have become members of Chicago United.
And so that's how your membership is all kind of business or business related,
yes.
But some not-for-profits as well.
Yes.
And how do you, when you talk to people about joining, what do you say, and what makes somebody want to join or organization want to join Chicago United? So
Chicago United is made up of a coalition of members of companies, and our shared value is around how companies can drive inclusion within organizations. We meet each company where they are. Not everybody is at the height of heights, and doing this inclusion, having a great inclusion journey. And so what they're coming for is, because we are a convener and a thought leader, we're really working with everyone within an organization, from the board member to the CEO, that mid-level manager, that emerging leader of color. And not everyone is a person of color that's within Chicago United, but they are companies and their leadership and their teams that really care about critical issues that they're facing around DE&I within the organization. So I think that's the pull. And then you're around peers, outside of your organization that are really looking for strategies to implement change around inclusion. So that's the draw, I believe.
So let's talk first about Business Leaders of Color. It's a signature program of the organization.
Yes, Business Leader of Color, of which I made sure that before I came, you were a business leader of color in 2005. It's 20 years old this year, and it was an initiative that was created out of our corporate diversity profile, which I'll talk about a little bit later. When we heard, over the decades, over years, how there are not people of color that are not senior enough or prepared enough to serve on boards. Well, Business Leader of Color was created to identify and create a platform for senior executive leaders of color who are prepared to sit on corporate boards. And for the last 20 years, we have identified over 470 business leaders of color. And we there's a publication and an honor at our Bridge Awards every November that we highlight those leaders of color. We added programming last year. We added back programming for those BLCs to help support their growth. I think you were on a panel for us last year. We work with Deloitte, who's also on our board, and their Center for Innovation that's around helping with boards prepare just senior leaders for boards. And our business leaders of color will come in and sit in sessions around intro to board governance or cybersecurity on boards, or just different hot topics that are trends around boards. And we believe that this is another way to equip our BLCs with the education and information so they are ready to serve.
So I want to step back just a little because my audience might not understand the significance of why it matters to have diversity on corporate boards. So let's talk a little bit about why this is an important topic and why it's important to identify leaders who can serve on boards.
So we believe inclusion drives performance. If you think about it in that way across all of our programming. So at the end of the day, inclusion creates and diverse thought increases shareholder value and it increases innovation. It's more than just a moral imperative. So with that being said, when we talk about BLCs and companies not being able to find them, when we did this corporate diversity profile, which is really looking at a snapshot of what C-suite, C-levels, executive level, and board level people within an organization, we saw that there were not people of color, right? And so people of color, as I said, bring in diverse thought, they bring in innovation, and they increase shareholder value. It's imperative that we make sure that we're creating a pipeline from those emerging leaders of color to those mid-level managers of people that are running these organizations. And so I think that's why it's important. In the last few years, especially after George Floyd, we've seen, which again I'll talk about a little later, we've seen a surge in C-suite, Black and brown people serving and Asians serving in C-suites and on boards, but we still have a lot of work to do. Right. But it's important that representation matters, as we all know, and diverse thought matters, and it's important that we all have a seat at the table.
Right, and boards are the entities that provide governance, oversight. In most organizations, they hire the CEO, and for many, many years, they were the space of white men.
Right.
Then women started cracking through, and only in recent years have people of color really started to get a seat at the table. Not only important for helping companies grow, as you said, improve performance, but they also can provide income and support to board members, right?
Exactly.
And so it's also a place for people of color to, literally have a seat at the table. So it becomes important.
And then what we've also seen is customers, right? Outside of just shareholders, customers, or our member companies have customers who want to see people that look like them. Right. And so the call isn't just from like an organization like ours, right? But their employees who are working there. The customers, their clients are also asking for this too. So this is another piece of the puzzle that I think is helping to continue to drive this change.
Right. And you, I think, keep all the leaders of color on your website, right?
Yes.
So now when people say, you know what, I can't find a diverse, qualified person for my board, you put that message to fault that as a falsehood because you have a website with over 400
470
people who are representative, diverse people who could serve on boards. And
across
so it's really all sectors, right?
Right, yes, across all sectors. In the last couple of years too, there's been a bit of a sea change when you were looking for that leader of color, that business leader of color that could serve on the board that had P&L responsibility. But now you're looking at people that have, thought leadership around DE&I, cybersecurity, compliance, the whole host of issues. And I think it really then, again, the inclusion piece around having that diverse thought at the board level creates change, and it's very impactful.
Right. Well, I also, I care a lot, as you know,
Yes.
about minority businesses and expanding economic opportunity for minority business. You have a program focused on that topic. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So Minority Business Partnership Program, which includes Fight Forward initiative, is really to help scale our minority businesses. When we came out of COVID, we did have our Inside Inclusion Report in 2020, and I had just come on in April of 2020. We did our Inside Inclusion Report. That was the corporate diversity profile. And during that time, we took a snapshot of what minority businesses were being impacted by COVID and the racial unrest. It was 40%, right? So when I came on, we really looked at how we could have more of a holistic approach to helping minority businesses. Fight Forward is our program that's focusing on procurement. So it's matching our committed companies within our membership with our minority businesses. And it's matching them with supplier diversity, if you think of it in that way. And that was like over 5 years, they choose 5 minority businesses, and they're working together, they're collaborating on spend. So what we thought was important was to have a more holistic approach, because those companies that were decimated through COVID and the social unrest, we needed to be a place, because of our ecosystem, that could support minority businesses with technical assistance, strategic alliance, government assistance, and capital. And so the last year and a half, Minority Business Partnership is, we have workshops and sessions. We work with our minority businesses. We moved it, and our highlight is highlighting the MBEs more so than we have in the past. And we've just seen, huge support around this, because they don't really have a place to go.
Right. So besides just giving them the work, you're giving them help to help get the work done.
Yes.
So
and
you
matching them.
Yes. All
right.
right.
Matching them with our committed, our
Your
companies
partners,
like
with your members,
Aon and
Awesome.
Walgreens. Yes.
So you mentioned the corporate inside inclusion, your corporate diversity profile. I know you just re-released it, not re-released, but you released it again. Were there any particular findings that surprised you?
A few. So of the top 50, so the way that we base our ranking, we highlight the top 50 companies in Chicago, public companies, based on their revenue. And so 13 of those public companies are Chicago United members, and we led in diversity, equity, inclusion around the C-suite and in executive rank. So that's wonderful. So what we did find, though, was that for Black and Asian, the numbers went up. For Hispanic, the numbers are lagging.
Wow.
And our numbers nationally overall, our numbers in Chicago lead the national number. So we are, we have had some traction, especially in the last 2 years, but we have a long way to go.
Well, I am so glad, first of all, to see you. Thank you for coming on the show, but also so glad that you are leading this critically important work at Chicago United. I truly cannot think of anybody better to be doing this work than you. Thanks for coming. Hopefully you'll come back.
I will.
All right,
Thank
thank you. We'll be right back with more on public safety.
Racial discrimination and bias have been ingrained in our criminal, legal, and law enforcement systems from its earliest days, and they continue to pervade every level of our systems today. This week on Change Agents, I'm joined by 2 incredible leaders who are working hard to improve our criminal justice system. Join me at 7:30 p.m. this Thursday on CAN-TV 19. Stream us on cantv.org or download and watch on the CAN-TV Plus app.
While out on the campaign trail, Brandon Johnson promised a holistic approach to safety that he believed would be key to making Chicago streets safer for all of us. So what all is in Mayor Johnson's plan, and how did the plan hold up under the first real test over Memorial Day weekend? Well, here to talk all about that and a lot more are today's roundtable participants, Patrick Smith, a criminal justice reporter at WBC, and Gregory Pratt, a City Hall reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Welcome. Thank you very much. So, safety, huge issue during the campaign, still a big issue for Chicagoans?
Absolutely. I mean, that was the number one, based on BEZ polling, the number one issue. I know I'm not telling anyone here something they didn't know. The number one issue during the election hasn't been that long since the election, as you were just talking about. So I think it's still a top issue. I would be guessing here, but I'm guessing the number one issue for Chicagoans.
Yeah, Tribune seeing the same thing?
No doubt about it. And, historically, if you travel abroad, people ask you about Michael Jordan. They might ask you about President Obama, but they will still ask you about Al Capone. Right. And that is the issue here and abroad.
Right. And I think now they also add, do you feel safe? That's what my relatives who are, in different parts of the country say. So Mayor Johnson had a plan in his campaign, and then he was 2 weeks in after he was sworn in, he had to announce his plan for the summer, which of course is a huge, big deal. What do you think of the plan? Both of you reported on it.
Well, I think it's a fine plan. It didn't strike me as particularly different from his predecessor or the predecessor before that. I remember covering Mayor Lightfoot's first Memorial Day weekend, preparation press conference, and it was a lot of what we heard from Mayor Brandon Johnson. A holistic approach. We're going to use police, but also anti-violence workers out there. We saw more of a stress, more of a focus on anti-violence workers, on non-policing solutions, but we also saw canceled days off for police officers, certainly something that the last administration was doing much to the chagrin of police officers.
Right, we're going to come back actually to that point. Was there anything in the plan that you thought was particularly new or different?
I don't mean this harshly, but the answer is no. I don't think there was anything that was new or different. Mayor Lightfoot was talking about whole of government, community outreach groups, which of course she did and deserves a lot of credit for trying to open up the department to being open to that. But aside from that, it was a lot of the same old stuff. And part of that is you run into the reality when you get elected to the position you campaign about, that, the reason that crime was an issue, the reason policing is an issue isn't because Mayor Lightfoot and Mayor Emanuel and Mayor Daley were stupid people who couldn't do simple things. It's because these are very hard, challenging things with very few options.
Right, and I think one other point, and we'll come back to this, I think, a little bit, is it takes some time for some of those efforts. We had a jobs component, we're going to do summer jobs. Well, that's not going to happen in 2 weeks, and even if it happens, may not have the same kind of impact. So I think you're right, that, not necessarily massively different, and I think because you don't have that many levers to pull, right? You have the police, you have the community groups, maybe you have the violence interrupters, not maybe, but you have them, and certainly I think he's putting some emphasis there, which I think is well received.
In fairness to Mayor Johnson also, because I didn't even mean that as a criticism, but in fairness, things like the youth jobs, he wants to double the amount of summer jobs for youth. We'll know more about how effective that is, whether or not he's able to deliver in 2 years, and it'll be fairer to judge him then than it is right now, 2 weeks after he comes in.
Right.
Yeah, I will say, to your point, a lot of what Mayor Johnson talked about on the campaign trail was root causes of gun violence, including the youth employment, trauma. Obviously, if you're trying to address root causes, we might not see the effects in 4 years. We're certainly not going to see them in 2 weeks. One thing that was a little different was the influx of peacekeepers, these community-based anti-violence workers that were funded by the state, and I do wonder if that is a little bit of an insight into what could be different, which is more cooperation and coordination between the state government and the city government, especially on this particular issue of gun violence.
Right. I think also I saw Interim Superintendent Waller embrace the peacekeepers and working with them, which has been an ongoing issue with the police department and different leaders and their relationship with their relationship with the peacekeepers and the violence interrupters. And I thought that was an important distinction as well.
Yeah, and that relationship has changed over the years as you've seen police leaders embrace it more. Superintendent David Brown at least spoke about supporting these community-based anti-violence workers. The big question is when you're out in the districts, out on the streets, do the average police officers feel similarly? What I've heard out there is that, that is actually starting to trickle down. There's more support and less skepticism from police officers toward these anti-violence workers.
Yeah, institutions take years to change, and for an idea at the top to trickle down, and it takes years for an idea from the bottom to reach the top as well. I remember I sat in Mayor Lightfoot's office 4 years ago, right before the holiday, talking about the need for outreach workers, and she said it's mission critical and that's going to change. And she hasn't perfected it, but they opened up millions of dollars in the budget and deserve real credit for that.
Right. But I think it is, it's part of it is changing the culture and the attitude, because it can be challenging for a police officer who one day has seen somebody be a member of a gang and be involved in gang, and the next week, a few months later or a year later, they're back on the street as a peacekeeper, right? And so it takes some time to adjust to that. So let's talk a little bit about the officers. How's the morale? Are you hearing anything about how morale is? Because part of the safety plan includes, or the summer safety plan includes canceling days off, which is tough. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken with officers in the past about how much those canceled days off really, really affect not just morale. I mean, I think morale can be a catch-all term. I think it's a fair one to use, but the mental health of these officers, their stability and their family lives. I mean, when we're talking about morale, we're talking about not just their job satisfaction, but how they're feeling personally, which I think we all need to care about because they're out there in fraught situations, and we need them to act appropriately. You're more likely to act appropriately if you are feeling stable, if you are mentally healthy. Canceled days off hurt that, and that was, I mean, there were all sorts of reasons why morale dipped, and I think it's true that it was very bad under Superintendent Brown and Mayor Lori Lightfoot, but a big reason was all of the canceled days off, and I think there was hope that maybe we would see less of that. I think at least this initial plan is pulling back on canceled days off. It's only one canceled day off, or was only one canceled day off of a Memorial Day weekend. We will see as the summer goes on, and I think unfortunately we can expect a lot of gun violence, whether or not they try to limit the canceled days off. And the only other thing I'll say about morale is, I've heard from a lot of officers who are very happy about the selection of interim superintendent Fred Waller. They really like Waller, and that was definitely seen as an olive branch from police officers. Catanzara in that New York Times, John Catanzara, the head of the FOP here in Chicago, in the New York Times piece predicted, mass resignations if Brandon Johnson was elected. I believe we got the records back from the city yesterday, and I think it's 28 officers who have resigned in the 2 months since he was elected.
Which is probably well within the realm of
Yes,
what's just
okay.
natural.
Normal, right?
Waller is very helpful for morale because Superintendent Brown was not from here, did not acclimate, did not pretend to be from here. He probably thinks Portillo's is the best hot dog in Chicago, which while it's good, it's not.
We know it's totally wrong.
And Waller is a real cop. He is a cop's cop. He is a Chicago guy. And that part was very strong message from Mayor Johnson, who has this skepticism from officers about him and who is trying to alleviate that with Waller, with his comments at the police graduation ceremony this week of, we're going to have your back. So it's morale is it's too soon to say, with no disrespect to police officers, they can be a sensitive bunch. Law enforcement people can be a sensitive bunch for tough guys. Usually tough guys are sensitive people. But there have been attempts to reach out by the administration that I think are showing some fruit.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about the selection of interim superintendent Waller. I had the privilege of working with him when I was in the mayor's office, and he was the head of the patrol, and he was simply, to your point, cops who cared deeply about the officers, but cared deeply about the community, which I think is a big help right now because it's a really important bridge. So totally great point. Let's talk a little bit about messaging, because we've talked about the fact that we can't really expect Mayor Johnson's plan to solve, to really, it's a long-term plan. But the fact is, Memorial Day weekend was horrific when it came to violence, as was this past weekend, and that tends to be the big point people go, right? They go, oh my God, Memorial Day weekend was a disaster, the plan didn't work. How do you write about that? How do you talk about that to tamp that down a little bit so that people aren't like, oh my God, he failed? Because we've already said that that's not really a fair way
One of the toughest things for a daily newspaper like the Tribune is you want to write truly and accurately about the unacceptable levels of gun violence in the city, but you also don't want people to turn it into a cartoon of, Chicago is a hellhole, as they like to say, and things like that, because it's just not true. And the safety levels get exaggerated by people. And you don't want to give people false expectations, and you also don't want to give someone a pass. And so it's very challenging and a work in progress. And I personally, my number one job is to cover the mayor and how are they doing. And I personally believe in giving them some grace and leeway, especially in the early days as we figure that out, and explain to people, he barely knows where the bathroom is yet. Before you expect them to solve decades of crime, let's give them some time to figure some things out.
Yeah.
I also think it's worth pointing out, when I think about how we're reporting on violence, I think perspective and context is important. I trust our listeners and the Tribune readers as well to understand that Mayor Johnson is not responsible for the crime numbers 2 weeks into his administration, but I do think it's important for people to know the context of, Memorial Day weekend, horrible bloodshed, unacceptable levels of violence. Frankly, the shooting numbers, about 50, is like more or less what we've been averaging on Memorial Day weekend for the last decade. So the number of people who were killed was very high, but the actual shooting incidents also very high, but not like exceptionally high. And May actually ended up with lower levels of violence than we had since 2019. Still elevated if you're looking back to like the early 2000s. And so that's important context. The levels are unacceptable. We are elevated. The reason we're on a downslope now is because things shot up so much in 2020. Right. But I think it's important for listeners and readers and viewers to know that this was bad, but it's not the worst it's ever been. Right. It's not exceptionally bad.
Right. Thank you. Well, you mentioned, we have just a couple more seconds, I think, but you mentioned a grace period. Do you think the Mayor Johnson's going to continue to get a little bit of a grace period or honeymoon, particularly on the violence issue?
I think that the people here in Chicago and everywhere really are forgiving and patient, especially if you're honest and upfront about some of this stuff. So I think so. It's not going to last forever. It probably won't last 6 months, but he has a little bit of time.
Yeah.
I actually think it's going to be slightly up to him. As I was mentioning, murders are actually trending slightly downward. If we have a June or July, and we can all hope for this, that is less violent, considerably less violent than the year before, and Mayor Johnson goes out there and takes credit for that, then that means if we have a spike in August, he's got to take the blame. Right. So it's going to be up to him to decide, how he's messaging the month-to-month or week-to-week crime numbers.
Right. I think that's a great point. How he messages is important. I do think, and both of you touched on this, he has been reaching out. He has been saying, the right things, and I think that helps set really the right tone, and that helps in terms of people building a relationship with him and maybe extending his honeymoon just a little bit longer. I cannot thank you both. We really got the best of the best. You both really know the city and you know these topics well, and I'm so grateful for you taking the time to be here with me today. Thank you very much. We'll be back with my closing thoughts in just a minute.
Hi, I'm Ryan G. I'm the host of Teenage. This week on Teenage, we'll be talking about mental health with a special guest, Miss Sylvia. What can tweens do to have good mental health?
Really having a good support system of adults that you can bounce ideas off of.
You can watch my show Friday nights, 7 o'clock on CanTV 19, CanTV.org, and the new CanTV Plus app.
As a former prosecutor and a former deputy mayor of Chicago, I'll be the first one to tell you that when it comes to addressing violence and crime, there are no easy answers. There are a lot of players and moving parts that have to come together if we hope to have any meaningful change on the safety front. But I know that if other major cities can develop strategies to improve crime rates, then it's possible here too. And we'll all be watching to see if Mayor Johnson is able to find the way that's most effective for us. I will see you next time, and until then, be well and be well informed.